about the Holocaust. Yesterday was about Pearl Harbor. You did finish brain pop, you need to do that. You did do the World War II brain pop on Friday, you need to do that. Today we're going to talk about the Holocaust, and there are some graphic images. The first two words that you write down are what these words mean. Holocaust is a Greek word that means burnt offering. Why would burnt be an acceptable?
Because they burned them.
They did burn people.
Yeah.
Did you tell me, Tardy?
Currently.
No. The Shoah is what the Jews call it because that means catastrophe in Hebrew. And they weren't concerned about the burning, they were concerned about all the other stuff that they considered a catastrophe. So these are the words that go in your notes for today. Now, you've already seen this slide with all these little icons because we talked about it before. If you're going to kill people systematically, you got to make them unhuman. You got to take away their power. First, no citizenship. That means the government can't do anything about it. They're not even people that you consider in your country in the first place. You can't let them marry other Jews. You don't want them to breed more people for you to deal with that you're trying to get rid of. You can't let them have jobs where they make money or spread their skills like publishing, lawyer, or doctor. Good question.
Yeah. Could they marry non-Jews?
No. Because they didn't want a chance
It
of
says
getting
fan
them.
marriage to non-Jews.
They didn't want them to breed any.
That's even worse than
even a percentage.
breeding together.
Yes.
So they didn't have the flags, they didn't have Mary, they didn't have the book, they didn't have all that?
No.
Why?
Because if you're going to kill people, you've got to take away their human ability to do so.
That's cat.
That is the point. And you can't let them be doctors or lawyers because you don't want them to save their lives and you don't want them to help them legally do anything. And you don't want them to teach anybody stuff because you don't want them to teach things that are Jewish or teach them any kind of skills that they would need to be successful. And keep them out of the government so they don't have any power to change any of the stuff that was done. The red border is where a lot of the concentration camps were. A lot of them were in Germany, but they also did a lot in Poland. And that's the first place Hitler invades after he says he's not going to. And that's where a lot of these things were. You've heard of some of these names, like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dachau, Buchenwald maybe. Buchenwald. These are all harsh German names. But this is where they had a camp. Now, I cannot figure out how many camps there were because there's discrepancy on what's a camp. Was it a place to hold people on their way to be killed? Is it a place where they were doing labor? Or is it a place where there actually were gas chambers and stuff? But there were thousands of them either way. They're just, some are labeled differently than others.
I got a question about this. What is that? Is that a state?
Falsenberg is a town.
Is it like far from you, isn't it?
Huh?
It's pretty, don't you have to fly there?
From here, yes. Now, this started
Right
in
there.
1933, and it went till 1945, and that was when the U.S. and the British and the German, or the French, started going into these places and letting people out. We didn't really know that what was happening, at least on the scale that it actually did. So this went on for at least a decade before people are actually aware and see pictures, and then it's traumatizing about what was actually going on. And Hitler was not the actual person who organized all of it. He had a person to do it. Heinrich Himmler was the one who actually made the system where you have trains, you ship them into these cities, you take their clothes, you shave their head, you take their valuables, then you start shoving them into the chambers to kill them, or use them for labor, or abuse them for fun. And so Himmler is actually one who orchestrated all of it. Hitler just had the idea to kill them all. Himmler is the one who carried it out. And it wasn't just Jews. If you didn't fit that category of who should be the in-group, if you were a communist, because Hitler hated communism, and a lot of Russians and Jews and Eastern Europeans were communists, if you were homosexual, if you were disabled in some way, you didn't fit the perfect category of blonde, blue-eyed, healthy German stock, you were an outsider.
So if you were like, so if you're gay,
Yeah.
you wouldn't do that?
They had you shipped off and killed.
Why?
Because you weren't in the perfect category.
That's,
Yeah.
Didn't Hitler like not consider black people to be in there either? Like what they should.
There weren't a lot of blacks there, but they weren't the in group.
maybe I would.
They were the degenerate jazz musicians that were corrupting the German youth. They were still bad.
Yeah.
There was a lot of abuse,
I,
like rape and abuse and starving people and giving them diseases on purpose and just executing them for fun depending on the mood swings of a Nazi officer. Because they weren't considered human, and so sometimes target practice was just a pastime. There was no human boundary here. Okay, this video is kind of long, but we didn't really know what was going on until we actually get in there. And it's going to take several years for the U.S. till they get to these concentration camps, because a lot of people didn't escape, so the message can't get out.
Your brain pops locked.
It's a memorial for the people who died in the Holocaust.
Yeah, I'll turn it on when we're ready.
Dear Tim and Moby, how did the Holocaust happen? From Dora. The Holocaust was the systematic murder of 6 million Jews during World War II. It seems impossible to imagine how human beings could do such terrible things. But it didn't just happen out of the blue. The path to genocide began years before the killing started. Genocide is when one group of people tries to wipe out another group because of who they are. In the Holocaust, the Nazis were trying to eliminate all Jews. The Nazis were a German political party whose leader was Adolf Hitler. In the 1920s and 30s, they rose to power by promising to restore Germany to its former glory. The country had suffered a humiliating defeat in World War I. Then, in 1929, the Great Depression, a global economic collapse, dealt the Germans another blow. Formerly a world power, Germany was on the verge of total collapse. Hitler and the Nazis insisted that the nation could regain its greatness. They said true Germans were part of a superior race, which was destined to rule the world. They just had to destroy the enemy secretly undermining them from within. That enemy, according to the Nazis, was the Jews. This anti-Semitism, racism against Jews, fueled the Nazis' rise to power. Anti-Semitism has a long history in Europe. Going back to the Middle Ages, Jews were viewed with suspicion for not following Christianity. Their differences made them targets of prejudice and violence. By the 20th century, most people thought that Europe had left that past behind, especially Germany. It was a center of modern thought and culture. The Nazis stirred up old prejudices with anti-Semitic propaganda, using newspapers, movies, and other mass media to push a particular message. They depicted Jews as rats or insects, blood-sucking enemies weakening Germany. The goal was to convince German citizens to turn on their neighbors, and it worked. In the 1932 election, the Nazi Party won a third of the seats in parliament. Within a year, Adolf Hitler was appointed the leader of Germany. 1 month later, someone burned down the Reichstag, the German parliament building. No one really knows who set the fire, but Hitler used it to seize more power. He blamed his party's political opponents and had them arrested. Citing national security, Hitler abolished freedom of speech, protest, and the press. He became the country's dictator, or absolute ruler. His personal security force, the Schutzstaffel, or SS, became the country's national police. They built large outdoor prisons called concentration camps because they concentrated large groups of people in one place. These were used to jail political enemies of the Nazi Party. Meanwhile, Hitler's regime began stripping Jewish citizens of their civil rights. Jews were banned from serving in the army and government and as doctors. Quotas, or limits, were placed on the number of Jewish students. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws defined German and Jew as different races. One law stated that only people of German blood could be citizens of Germany, and only citizens had political rights. The Roma Sinti, another ethnic minority, were targets of similar regulations. Other laws singled out gay people, communists, and the disabled. Anyone who didn't fit the Nazi idea of the master race. Jews were forced to wear yellow stars so people would know who to target. and citizens were encouraged to harass and attack them on the streets. On November 9, 1938, violence exploded in a wave of attacks. It looked like a riot had just suddenly happened. But we now know that it was secretly led by SS officers acting on specific orders. Many wore regular clothes to blend in with the crowd. Neighbors joined in to destroy Jewish-owned shops, burn synagogues, and murder 90 Jews. Another 30,000 were arrested and sent to concentration camps. It was called Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Many Jews had already left Germany. After Kristallnacht, more and more tried to escape. They sought safety in other countries, at embassies and at the borders. Most were turned away. The U.S. refused to change its laws to allow more European Jews to move here. Countries around the world expressed sympathy, but kept their doors closed. In May of 1939, a ship called the St. Louis arrived in Cuba. It carried 900 Jewish refugees from Germany, all with legal entry visas. But at the last minute, Cuba denied them entry. The U.S. turned them away too, and so did Canada. Captain Gustav Schroeder refused to return to Germany until his passengers found safe harbor. Eventually, they were divided among France, Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, touching off World War II. Within a year, most of Europe was under German control. This brought the fates of millions more Jews into the hands of the Nazis, including those who thought they had escaped, like the passengers from the St. Louis. Jews were stripped of their property and forced into ghettos, walled-off sections of cities. Conditions were extremely crowded, with little food and almost no medicine. From there, they were shipped off to a vast network of concentration camps. The Nazis now had hundreds of these prisons across Europe. Prisoners spent their days doing hard labor, and their nights crammed into unheated sheds. They died by the thousands from torture, disease, and starvation. Well, for the Nazis, none of this went far enough. So Hitler's administration devised a final solution: total extermination. Families were rounded up and shot by the thousands. And in late 1941, the Nazis began to build death camps with gas chambers. These were airtight rooms that were filled with deadly poisonous gas. Prisoners were told they were showers. The shower heads poured gas, not water. By the end of the war, the Nazis had killed 6 million Jews, plus 5 million others. When the Allies won the war, the camps were liberated. Photographs of skeletal survivors, gas chambers, smokestacks, and piles of bodies shocked the world. People struggled to comprehend the scale of the Nazis' crimes. Party leaders were prosecuted at a special court in the German city of Nuremberg. Accusing them of murder didn't seem big enough to fit their crimes, so they were charged with a new category of offense: crimes against humanity. The newly formed United Nations took steps to prevent another Holocaust. Its countries agreed to work together to root out and punish genocide and to welcome immigrants fleeing from violence. Tragically, genocides do still happen around the world, and governments rarely act in time to stop them. But as individuals, we can push our leaders to do something when we see the warning signs. When a society decides that only certain people belong and others are the enemy, when one group of people is labeled animals or a disease, when people are denied their rights and cut off from society, when they're victimized just because of who they are, we know where that can lead. And we all have a responsibility to stop it.
Now, the next few scenes are from your textbook, and they are some graphic images. This one is where they were standing in groups and lines for roll call. And if your name was called out and you didn't answer, they assumed you were escaped, and they were looking for you to do some kind of punishment, usually beaten or death. Falkenwald is in Germany, and although it was an extermination camp, they weren't killing as their main goal. It was to just have people in harsh conditions. So it didn't matter the weather, it didn't matter the clothing you had on, your health, your status. You were supposed to stand tall, in a perfect line, don't move, and they would do it for hours at a time just as a torture method, because some people couldn't literally stand that long. And then if you were stepped out of line, collapsed, sick, cough, or something, they would take you out and beat you or eliminate you because you weren't following the rules. And they would do this for all parts of the day. This was a march because they knew they needed to move people to a different place because the Allies were close. So the Allies kind of did a snake feature where they wrapped around the Nazis and squeezed them to the middle and forced them to surrender. Dachau was one of the biggest camps where they had prisoners, and they had 30,000 prisoners that died. And toward the end of the war, the Nazis knew that what they were doing was going to be exposed. So they needed to move people and move evidence to somewhere else that was less likely to be invaded. So this is on April 26, 1945. Hitler's already killed himself. This group has got... Jack? Whoever's got music going on, can you stop?
Not yet.
This march is to get the people somewhere else. And now 1,000 people died because they weren't even healthy enough to walk, and so they kind of dropped off as they were there. But it was 3 days later that the Allies actually got to the camp and let people be free. So some of these people were within 3 days of being saved, and some of them didn't make it because of the march. Yes?
So that's where Hitler died, right?
No, Hitler didn't die here, but by late April, Hitler's already gone, so there's no real leadership in the Nazi Party. Now it's just destroying the evidence.
Yeah, so the last slide that you had of all the people.
Yeah, they're trying to move them somewhere else.
So you say if you didn't call your name, you did, basically, right?
Now, they had to treat them like cattle, so you had to take them to trains, and this is Heinrich Himmler's grand plan. You have men on one side and women on the other. The kids are all squared away with wherever, and you have no windows, no seats, no seat belts. You're just shoving them in there as much as you can physically pack into a car, and then the trains are a one-way ticket to somewhere. This was from Hungarian Jews, because it wasn't just Germans. Put that away. Put it away. Just because you were not a German Jew, you were still a target. So the Hungarians were shoved in here, and there is a memorial now at Auschwitz, because it's one of the biggest ones. Birkenau had 90,000 prisoners. You're talking about a huge city. We don't have a lot of cities in the U.S. that are 90,000 people, let alone 90,000 people that are going to be systematically killed. Their glasses, their jewelry, their clothes, their hair, everything was shaved off and organized into piles before they shoved them into a chamber. This is from Treblinka, where they would just starve people because they weren't about to give them healthy food to work, because they were trying to eliminate them in the first place. So once the body has used calories and there isn't a lot of you left, and your hair has been shaved and you have generic clothes, it's hard to even recognize people. This one had 10,000 inmates, and it was the second camp towards the death factory, because it's kind of like baseball minor leagues. You have minor league camps, and then you have the big league camps where the actual death was going on. And when you offer people showers who've been in this kind of condition, it sounded great. But nobody ever came out of the showers, because it wasn't a cleanly shower, it was a gas chamber that you were showered from above. And so they didn't know that's what they were going to. They had an inkling they were coming out. But this is how they did 800,000 people. And if you were somehow still healthy enough to physically move, you were the one that had to take the bodies out of the chamber, dig the hole, and shove them in there. Or get them to the crematorium.
So they did that to you if you were like starving to do it?
If, at some point, if you're too weak to do anything and you're useless as work.
So they just put you in a cage, basically.
No, they kill you.
Well, they'll kill you, but you're in a cage when you're not working. And you're not
Yeah, that's what I said.
Mhm.
When you're not working.
Then, if you should happen to be a twin or triplet or whatever, you were a target of the angel of death. That is Joseph Mengele on the far left, and he had an obsession with twins, because although he was a doctor, he was doing experiments on twins to do stuff to one twin to see if it would change the other twin. And we know that what we do to one person doesn't necessarily mean it happens to the other, but he would do all these experiments, like give one a disease, give one an experimental drug, operate on one to see if the other one would feel it, and most of the twins did not survive. Yeah? Okay. So there were a lot of sterilizations. They gave them certain diseases. They would starve them, taint the food, see if they could survive. The picture of the old woman up there is Eva Kor. twin that survived. Her twin died. But she ended up in Indiana, and she's lived here for a little time, and she just died 2 years ago. But she has a Holocaust museum in Terre Haute to get the message out about what they were doing and signs for this stuff was going on. And it wasn't the Germans weren't the only ones doing this at the time. Japanese were also doing experiments in this island 731. They were doing experiments on a whole nother level, like operating people while they're awake, attaching body parts to other people, changing DNA and ovomes and stuff to see if you could grow a hybrid species, like trying to put wings on an alligator kind of stuff. I mean, they had an extreme form.
That's her up there, isn't it? That,
Yeah.
Like older lady.
Yeah, she survived, but her twin didn't. So this is gonna have some graphic images, but this is what was going on.
The war crimes for which Nazi Germany was responsible are widely considered some of the most abhorrent of all time, and are often seen as the greatest evil of World War II. But in truth, similar horrors, and in some cases even worse crimes, were carried out by units in other World War II era powers. Imperial Japan's Unit 731 contained perhaps the worst of these war criminals, and committed some of the greatest crimes against humanity in the history of the world. Unit 731, officially termed the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, was created in 1935 and operated out of a facility in Manchuria. The unit was originally run by Japanese military police, but was taken over by General Shiro Ishii in fairly short order. The unit ran under the cover of being an epidemic prevention department, but it was in fact the opposite. General Ishii had been tasked with developing chemical weapons and had been given permission to use human experimentation. Unit 731 operated in a number of facilities in Manchuria and at its height in 1939 contained 10,000 personnel. Their primary facility operated under the cover of being a logging facility, which led to the unit's personnel referring to the people sent to the site for experimentation as logs. These human guinea pigs were mostly Chinese, though Allied prisoners of war were experimented on by the unit as well. The unit had a long list of crimes to its name, including dissection of human subjects while they were still alive, injection of prisoners with deadly diseases, forced transmission of syphilis, rape, chemical attacks on nearby civilian targets, and testing weapons on live, unarmed targets. Unit 731 had 8 divisions, which focused on weaponizing disease, researching biological weapons, developing artillery shells containing biological agents, producing and storing bacteria, training personnel, maintaining equipment, medical duties, and administration respectively. Several so-called breakthroughs achieved by Unit 731 led to the development of weapons that saw varying degrees of use in the Pacific Theater. Bombs designed to spread disease or deforest land were the most common of these weapons, while among the more sinister were food stores tainted with pathogens that were dropped in areas of China that continued to resist Japan, or were given to unsuspecting civilians in Japanese-controlled parts of China. Hundreds of thousands of people died as a result of these attacks, and near the end of the war, the unit was even preparing biological agents for an attack on San Diego, California, though the war ended before this could be executed. After the war, the remaining personnel of Unit 731 fled Soviet wrath to Japan and attempted to destroy the evidence of their work with limited success. Unfortunately, not all the members of the unit were brought to justice. The United States secretly offered many who worked with the unit immunity, provided that they shared their findings with the United States government and them alone. Those that were captured by the USSR didn't fare much worse, as despite the conviction of several unit members during the Khabarovsk trials, none received a sentence worse than 25 years in a Siberian gulag. To this day, not all the details about Unit 731's activities are public knowledge, but regardless of the full extent of their activities, what we do know about them is enough to paint a full picture of the atrocities that the unit carried out, which were on the same level, if not worse, as the experiments of Josef Mengele in Nazi Germany.
So some of them were developing chemical weapons, and there was a plan to try to get it to the U.S. in California, because that's the closest Japan is to us. But the war was over before they could do it. And the data that these scientists were doing, part of the agreement was when the U.S. came in and took the Pacific under control was they had to give the data to us, and it's not been released. So we don't know the full extent publicly about what they've actually done, what they've actually learned from their experiments, that nobody else in the world is supposed to have it. And now it's illegal to do, well,
The war,
just about all of it that they were doing at the time.
the war crimes?
Now, the final solution was Hitler was trying to get all of the Jews like exterminated completely. I don't know if this railroad is, I don't know if that's bodies or just snow piled up in a certain way, but the trains went one way. And they were trying to dump off as much livestock as they possibly could. And Hitler didn't come up with this idea on his own. We think that he got the idea for the final solution from the Armenians who were killed by the Ottomans because they accused the Armenians of being too friendly to the Russians when they were fighting World War I. And so the marching of people, taking their rights away, taking their valuables away, and then letting them just starve to death forever was actually something somebody else had created before. The Nazis realized that they needed to have mobile units because they were dealing with such a sheer amount of people they were trying to kill. You needed transportation, and you needed transportation to just ship them all to one place and be as systematic as possible. They weren't as reckless as the Japanese. They're doing crazy stuff. But they had to have crematoriums just to deal with the body count of the people that they killed because you can't leave the bodies around. So they had to just cremate on a high basis. Now I'm going to unlock the brain pop and I will take your best score.